The frigid air of the Grand Astoria ballroom shimmered under a dozen crystal chandeliers, a sea of $1 million in designer silk and tailored wool gliding across polished marble floors. Each laugh was a carefully curated note in a symphony of influence, every smile a practiced artifice. Among New York's titans, Mrs. Eleanor Vance reigned supreme, a queen on a throne of old money and new power. Her silver hair was coiled in an impeccably sculpted bun, her gaze sharper than any of the diamonds that adorned her slender, wrinkled neck. She was the matriarch of Vance Enterprises, a woman whose name alone silenced rooms and commanded fealty. Her empire built on a legacy of shrewd deals and an unyielding glacial ambition. Beside her stood her son, William Vance, the current CEO, a perfect paragon of modern corporate power. He was handsome in a way that seemed sculpted rather than born, his jaw sharp, his eyes scanning the opulent spectacle with an almost clinical detachment. He saw assets, liabilities, and opportunities, not people. And invisible amidst it all was Sarah Jenkins. She moved through the glittering crowd not as a guest, but as a ghost in a stark black uniform, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to the performative elegance around her. Visually impaired since she was a child, Sarah navigated the treacherous terrain of high society with a slender white cane, its tip tapping a rhythmic, almost unheard counterpoint to the orchestral swells of Vivaldi. Tonight, her task was to be a phantom limb for the elite, refilling champagne flutes before they were empty, a shadow in a world that refused to acknowledge her presence, let alone her worth. Close to her heart, tucked beneath the crisp collar of her uniform, lay her most prized possession, a delicate sterling silver necklace. Its surface was cool against her skin, its smooth pendant etched with what an unknowing eye might see as an abstract design. But to Sarah's fingertips, it was a meticulously inscribed passage in Braille, a final, cherished gift from her late mother. It was her anchor in a world that often felt like a storm. As the evening wore on, the veneer of polite society began to fray, worn thin by champagne and entitlement. A particularly boisterous socialite, Mrs. Beverly Sterling, a woman known for a tongue sharper than her diamond earrings, swept past Sarah near a velvet rope display of priceless artifacts. The tip of Sarah's cane inadvertently brushed against the hem of her emerald green designer gown. It was a touch as light as a moth's wing, but Mrs. Sterling reacted as if she'd been struck. "Watch where you're going, girl," she snapped, her voice a piercing shriek that sliced through the elegant hum of conversation. Several heads turned. Mrs. Sterling, seizing her audience, scoffed loudly and turned to Mrs. Vance, who had approached, drawn by the sudden unseemly commotion. "Some people just don't know their place, do they, Eleanor?" Mrs. Vance's icy blue eyes swept over Sarah, a slow, deliberate appraisal that felt like being stripped bare. She took in the cheap fabric of the uniform, the utilitarian cane, the quiet, mortified apology already forming on Sarah's lips. It was a dismissal in a single glance. "Indeed, Beverly," Eleanor Vance replied, her voice a silk-lined dagger, each word perfectly enunciated to carry. "This is a charity gala, not a marketplace. Perhaps our event staff needs a refresher course on spatial awareness." A ripple of hushed, cruel chuckles spread through the small cluster of socialites who had gathered like vultures to a carcass. Sarah's cheeks burned with a humiliation so profound it felt physical, a heat that spread from her face down to her trembling fingers. She felt utterly transparent, her spirit shrinking under the collective, disdainful gaze of people who saw her as less than human, an obstacle, a piece of faulty furniture. She simply bowed her head, the apology dying in her throat, and retreated into the shadows of the grand ballroom, her heart a raw, throbbing bruise in her chest. But that moment of crushing humiliation was not the beginning of her story. To understand the steel in Sarah Jenkins's spine, the quiet fire that burned beneath her deferential exterior, you have to go back 2 weeks to a small third-floor apartment in Queens that felt a universe away from the marble floors and crystal chandeliers of the Grand Astoria. The apartment was modest, but filled with a determined warmth. The scent of lavender and old books hung in the air. This was Sarah's world, a world centered entirely around her younger sister, Emily. At 17, Emily shared Sarah's visual impairment, but not her quiet resignation. Emily's spirit was a bright, defiant flame. She dreamed of becoming a musician, her fingers dancing across the keys of the aging upright piano that took up nearly a quarter of their small living room. "Try it again, Em," Sarah said softly, her voice a gentle encouragement. She was sitting at their small kitchen table, a pile of overdue bills pushed to one side as she traced the Braille text of a history textbook with her fingertips. Emily sighed, a dramatic, teenagerly sound. "It's the transition to the C minor, Sarah. My fingers keep fumbling it. It's like they have a mind of their own." "Your fingers are brilliant," Sarah countered, not looking up from her book. "They just need to trust you. Close your eyes. Well, you know what I mean. Feel the music. Don't think about the notes." Emily took a deep breath, and the first few bars of a complex Chopin piece filled the small apartment, hesitant at first, then growing in confidence. Sarah smiled. This was her purpose. Every grueling shift she worked, every casual cruelty she endured from customers who tossed money on the counter instead of placing it in her hand, it was all for this, for Emily's music, for Emily's future. A future that was becoming terrifyingly expensive. The letter from the specialist's office lay on the counter, its embossed heading a stark reminder of their precarity. A new experimental treatment, one that could potentially halt the progression of Emily's condition, was available. The cost was astronomical, a figure with so many zeros it seemed like a cruel joke. 5 figures, more money than Sarah had ever seen in her life. It's a struggle so many know too well, the feeling of drowning while the world sails by. If you've ever felt invisible, fighting a battle no one else can see, tap that like button and show Sarah she's not alone in this fight. Later that night, long after Emily was asleep, Sarah sat in the dark, the city lights painting faint stripes across the floor. She held her silver necklace, her thumb tracing the familiar raised dots of the Braille inscription. She didn't need to read it. The words were etched onto her soul. They were her mother's words, a passage from a letter Elizabeth Jenkins had written to her just before she died, too young from an illness their meager insurance barely covered. "Never let anyone define your worth, my starlight," the inscription read. "Your vision is not in your eyes but in your mind. It is a legacy of light." Her mother, Elizabeth, had been a scientist, a woman with a mind that crackled with brilliance. She'd always been working on something, scribbling complex equations into notebooks Sarah couldn't read, speaking of patents and partnerships with a hopeful fire in her eyes. Then one day, the fire had just gone out. A deep, quiet sadness had settled over her, a resignation that Sarah, even as a child, had felt, but never understood. Their fortunes had turned, a promised windfall vanishing into thin air, and soon after her mother's health began to fail. The memory was a dull ache, a question mark at the center of her life. Her mother's legacy. What had she meant? All Sarah felt she had inherited was a mountain of responsibility and a world that saw her as broken. The offer for the serving gig at the Vance Enterprises charity gala had come a few days later. The pay was triple her usual rate for a single night's work. It was a drop in the ocean compared to what Emily needed, but it was a start. It was hope. The agency warned her it was a high-pressure environment, that the clientele was demanding. But Sarah was no stranger to demanding people. She knew how to make herself small, how to be unobtrusive, how to be invisible. It was a survival skill she had perfected over a lifetime. She accepted the job, her heart heavy with a strange mixture of dread and determination. She needed that money, and she would endure whatever the night threw at her to get it. She had no idea that by stepping into that world of glittering cruelty, she wasn't just walking toward a paycheck. She was walking toward a collision with her past and a destiny that had been stolen from her mother long ago. The biting New York wind did little to cool the fire burning on Sarah Jenkins's cheeks. Each step away from the gala's gilded entrance felt like a mile, her cane tapping a frantic, unsteady rhythm on the unforgiving pavement. The humiliation was a physical weight, a shroud of icy disdain that clung to her more tenaciously than the cheap wool of her coat. Mrs. Vance's words, sharp and crystalline as the chandeliers she stood under, echoed in her mind. "Perhaps our event staff needs a refresher on spatial awareness." The polite, cruel laughter that followed was a sound she knew would haunt her sleep. The subway ride home was a descent into another world, a jarring transition from the scent of champagne and expensive perfume to the smell of damp coats and exhaust fumes. Here, she was invisible in a different way, not as a piece of service furniture, but as just another tired face in a sea of anonymous commuters, each lost in their own private battles. She let herself into the small, meticulously clean apartment she shared with her sister, the silence a welcome balm. The air inside was warm, smelling faintly of the lavender soap Emily loved. Kicking off her worn-out flats, Sarah moved through the tiny living room, her movements practiced and sure. In the corner, a single lamp cast a soft glow on a small desk, cluttered with large print books and a Braille machine. This was their sanctuary, a world away from the judgment of women like Eleanor Vance. Her sister Emily was already asleep in their shared bedroom, her breathing soft and even. A half-empty glass of water and a small bottle of prescription eye drops sat on the nightstand, a stark reminder of the constant crushing weight of their reality. Emily's condition was degenerative, more aggressive than Sarah's own, and the experimental treatment that gave her a fighting chance cost more per month than Sarah earned in 3. A white envelope was propped against the lamp on the kitchen counter. It was another notice from the specialist's office, the polite but firm font a familiar harbinger of dread. Payment overdue. Sarah's stomach clenched. She had worked 3 double shifts this week, her feet aching and her spirit worn thin, all for a number that barely made a dent in the one printed on that piece of paper. The contrast was a bitter pill to swallow. Tonight, she had poured wine that cost more than their monthly rent into glasses held by people who would never know the gnawing fear of choosing between medicine and groceries. People like William Vance, the handsome, detached CEO whose face was plastered on the cover of the business magazine she'd seen at the newsstand. He lived in a world of abstract numbers and soaring profits, a world so far removed from her own that it might as well be on another planet. A quiet, simmering resentment burned in her chest, not just for the Vances, but for the entire cruel architecture of a world that allowed such disparity to exist. Her fingers went to the sterling silver necklace at her throat, the cool metal a familiar comfort. She traced the tiny, raised dots, a language of touch that felt more real than anything she had experienced tonight, her mother's final gift. "This is your story, Sarah," she had whispered, her voice weakened by illness. "Never forget where you come from. It's more important than you know." At the time, Sarah had thought she meant their family's legacy of resilience, of making do with dignity. Now the words felt heavier, laden with a meaning that still eluded her. Shaking her head, she knew she couldn't afford to wallow. She had to finish her shift. The agency would dock her pay if she left early, and they couldn't afford to lose a single dollar. Taking a deep breath and fortifying herself with a glass of water, she put the overdue notice face down and quietly slipped out of the apartment, back into the cold night and toward the world that had so carelessly dismissed her. Returning to the gala was like stepping back into a lion's den. She kept her head down, her focus narrowed to the trays of glasses, the empty plates, the discreet refilling of water goblets. She tried to make herself smaller, more invisible than ever, praying she wouldn't cross paths with Mrs. Vance or the sharp-tongued Mrs. Sterling again. The main ballroom was still a vibrant swirl of noise and color, but Sarah sought refuge in the periphery, collecting empty flutes from the quieter, less trafficked corridors that branched off the main hall. It was in one of these hushed, carpeted alcoves, tucked away behind a large floral arrangement, that she paused to rest her aching back for just a moment. That's when she heard the voices. They were low, but the acoustics of the empty hallway carried them with an unnerving clarity from a nearby study, whose door was slightly ajar. "The risk is becoming untenable, Eleanor," a man's grave voice said. Sarah recognized it as belonging to Mr. Thompson, the Vance family's long-standing attorney, who had been hovering near the matriarch all evening. "The risk has been managed for 40 years, Arthur." Eleanor Vance's voice was a thread of chilled steel, all traces of her public-facing charm gone. "What has changed?" "Time," Mr. Thompson replied. "Statutes of limitation are one thing, but public perception is another. If a journalist, any journalist, were to start digging into the company's origin story, into the foundation of the technology. They might find the cracks. They might find her name. Sarah froze, her hand hovering over a champagne flute. She knew she should move away, that this was a private conversation she had no right to hear. But the intensity in their voices, the palpable tension, held her captive. Her name was erased for a reason, Mrs. Vance snapped. Elijah was very clear on that. It was a clean break. The settlement was generous for the time. A settlement she never signed, Eleanor. A partnership dissolution she contested until the day she died. We have the letters, buried, but they exist. And the patent, the original filing, the one from June 7th, 1986. Her signature is on the initial draft right beside Elijah's. We made sure the final version was sanitized. But the drafts, if someone knew where to look. A cold dread, sharp and unfamiliar, snaked its way up Sarah's spine. June 7th, 1986. The date. It was a meaningless string of words, yet it struck a chord deep within her, a dissonant note of recognition she couldn't place. No one knows where to look, Mrs. Vance said with finality, though a tremor of unease had entered her voice. The partner is gone. Her children, if she had any, would be nobodies. They would have no idea, no proof. Proof can be found in the strangest of places, Mr. Thompson murmured, his voice heavy with foreboding. All it takes is one loose thread, one piece of forgotten paper, one old photograph, one person who remembers the truth of what Elizabeth did for this company. Elizabeth. The name hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mother's name. Elizabeth Jenkins. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a cruel, impossible coincidence. But the date kept echoing in her mind, a frantic, insistent drumbeat. June 7th, 1986. Why did that feel so important? Her hand, trembling now, flew to her necklace. Her thumb swept desperately over the cool, familiar bumps of the Braille inscription. It wasn't a poem or a quote from a book. It was a passage her mother had made her memorize as a child, calling it their family's secret story. A story about a brilliant invention, a partnership, a promise. And at the end of the passage, a date. The date it was all formalized. Her blood ran cold as her fingers traced the final, undeniable sequence of dots. June 7th, 1986. The world tilted, the hushed corridor seeming to warp and stretch around her. The necklace wasn't just a sentimental piece of silver. It was a record. It was a testament. It was the proof Mr. Thompson feared, hanging around the neck of the invisible girl his client had just humiliated. The forgotten partner wasn't just a ghost from the past. She was her mother, and Sarah, her daughter, was standing right outside the door. The words of Mr. Thompson echoed in the hollow space behind Sarah Jenkins's eyes, a cruel and persistent ghost, a forgotten partner, her name deliberately erased from history. The chill of the marble floor seemed to seep through the thin soles of her uniform shoes, climbing up her legs and settling deep in her bones. The humiliation from Mrs. Sterling and Mrs. Vance felt like a distant, shallow wound now, a paper cut compared to the gaping chasm that had just opened in her understanding of the world. Her mother. They were talking about her mother. It couldn't be a coincidence. The date Mr. Thompson had mentioned, June 7th, 1986, was a sacred number in their small family, a date whispered with a mixture of pride and sorrow she had never fully understood. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She needed to know. Not later, not tomorrow, now. Her fingers tightened around the cool, familiar metal of her cane as she navigated away from the alcove, her movements no longer deferential but furtive, driven by an urgency that bordered on panic. The opulent sounds of the gala, the string quartet, the clinking of crystal, the curated laughter washed over her, a tide of noise from a world that suddenly felt alien and predatory. Every smiling face seemed to mask a lie. Every jewel seemed to glitter with stolen light. She found what she was looking for near the service entrance, a small, windowless storage closet, smelling faintly of lemon-scented polish and starched linen. It was an anonymous, forgotten space, a perfect hiding place for an invisible girl on the verge of uncovering an invisible truth. Sarah slipped inside, the click of the door shutting out the symphony of deceit from the ballroom. In the sudden, thick silence, her own breathing sounded unnervously loud. With trembling fingers, she pulled her phone from the pocket of her apron. The device was old, the screen webbed with a fine mesh of cracks, but it was her lifeline. She swiped it on, the accessibility feature she relied on, voiceover, immediately greeting her with its calm, synthetic voice. "Phone unlocked," it announced. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady her hands enough to type. Her thumbs hovered over the small virtual keyboard. What did she even search for? The words jumbled in her head. Vance Enterprises patent, June 7, 1986. Her fingers moved, clumsy at first, then with increasing speed. She navigated to the search engine, her brow furrowed in concentration as she dictated the search terms through the phone's microphone. "Vance Enterprises," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Foundational patent, 1986. The phone processed the query. The mechanical voice began to read a list of search results, financial articles, corporate histories, press releases. It was a wall of information, a digital fortress designed to protect the Vance legacy. "No," Sarah muttered to herself, shaking her head. She had to be more specific. She remembered Mr. Thompson mentioning a patent number, or at least a specific technology. What was it? Something about microprocessing conduits. The phrase had sounded like jargon then, but now it felt like a key. She tried again, adding the technical term to her search. This time the results were different. The robotic voice of her screen reader began to recite the title of a public filing from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. "Patent number 4,597,811, it intoned. "Method and apparatus for advanced microprocessing conduits. Filing date, June 7, 1986. Inventor Elijah Vance." The name hit her like a physical blow. Elijah Vance, Eleanor's late husband, the patriarch. There was no other name listed, not Elizabeth Jenkins, just him. Alone. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah. Her free hand went to the necklace at her throat, her thumb frantically tracing the familiar bumps of the Braille inscription. It was a nervous habit, something she did for comfort, but now it was a desperate act of verification. "Read abstract," she commanded the phone, her voice barely a whisper. The phone obliged. "An innovative system for regulating thermal energy in silicon microprocessors, utilizing a proprietary liquid cooling agent," the voice droned on, a stream of technical language that would have been meaningless to anyone else, but not to Sarah. These were her mother's words, her mother's ideas. She could almost hear them in Elizabeth's gentle, excited voice, the way she used to explain the wonders of science to her two young daughters, making the most complex concepts sound like magic. These weren't just technical terms. They were fragments of her childhood, echoes of a brilliant mind at work. As the phone continued to read, Sarah's fingers traced the parallel text on her necklace. The two streams of information, one digital and cold, the other tactile and imbued with love, began to merge into a single devastating narrative. The patent filing described the innovation. The Braille on her necklace described the partnership. Her mother's inscription wasn't just a passage, it was a testament. It named both inventors, Elijah Vance and Elizabeth Jenkins. It cited the date of their signed agreement. It detailed the profit-sharing terms, 50-50, that had been agreed upon before a witness. It was a secret contract, a hidden history, preserved in a language the sighted world so easily overlooked. The truth settled upon her not with a fiery rage, but with a glacial coldness. It froze the panic in her chest, solidifying it into something hard and sharp. Her mother hadn't just been forgotten, she had been robbed, deliberately, systematically. Elijah Vance had taken her genius, patented it under his name alone, and built an empire upon it. And his wife, the elegant and composed Mrs. Eleanor Vance, had known. She knew tonight, standing on that stage talking about integrity, while her family's fortune was built on the greatest of lies. If you believe stories like this deserve justice, please give this video a like so more people can hear Sarah's story. The memory of the earlier humiliation returned, but now it was refracted through the prism of this monstrous betrayal. Mrs. Vance's disdainful look, her cutting words, "This is a gala, not a marketplace," were no longer the casual cruelty of a wealthy woman toward a servant. It was the arrogance of a thief, sneering at the rightful heir of the treasure she was guarding. They had taken everything from her mother, her credit, her fortune, her legacy, and had left her with nothing. They had condemned her daughters to a life of struggle, forcing Sarah to work in the very halls of the palace built on her mother's stolen dreams, all while her sister, Emily, suffered without the medical care they could have easily afforded 100 times over. The quiet, deferential part of her, the part that had been trained for a lifetime to apologize for her own existence, to make herself smaller, to not be a burden, simply died in that dusty closet. It withered and turned to ash, burned away by the white-hot fury that now coursed through her veins. What took its place was something new, something hard, something unyielding. It was her mother's brilliance, her father's quiet strength, and her own fierce, protective love for her sister, all forged into a single, sharp point of purpose. She thought of Emily, of her bright laugh and her frustration with a world not built for her. She thought of the mounting medical bills, the specialists they couldn't afford, the therapies that were always just out of reach. All of that suffering was a direct consequence of the document her phone had just read aloud. The Vances didn't just steal a patent, they stole Emily's future. They stole Sarah's peace of mind. The decision was not a choice, it was an inevitability. It was the only possible response to a lifetime of injustice. She could not walk out of this gala and go back to her life. She could not polish their silver and serve their champagne, knowing that every sparkling flute, every glittering chandelier was paid for with her mother's stolen legacy. To remain silent now would be to become complicit in her own family's erasure. Sarah pushed the closet door open, stepping back out into the muffled sounds of the hallway. The air felt different, charged with possibility. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But the righteous anger was bigger. It was a fire that warmed her, that straightened her spine. She was no longer just Sarah Jenkins, the visually impaired server. She was Elizabeth Jenkins's daughter. And the gala, this glittering monument to the Vances' success, was not over. For them it was just beginning. For her it was the perfect stage. Her cane tapped against the marble floor. The sound no longer soft or hesitant, but sharp, clear and deliberate. Each tap was a drumbeat, counting down the final seconds of a lie that had lasted for far too long. The crystal chandeliers cast 1,000 fractured stars across the ballroom as Mrs. Eleanor Vance approached the podium. A hush fell over the assembly, a practiced reverence for the woman who was not merely a host, but the very architect of their world. She tapped the microphone once, a sound that was both delicate and commanding, and a warm, rehearsed smile graced her lips. Her voice, smooth and resonant, filled the vast space, weaving a narrative of tradition, philanthropy, and unshakable family values. For over 50 years, Mrs. Vance began, her gaze sweeping across the faces of New York's elite. The Vance name has been synonymous with integrity, with innovation, with a legacy not just of financial success, but of moral fortitude. We build things that last, not just skyscrapers, but communities, not just fortunes, but futures. From his front row seat, William Vance watched his mother, a familiar mix of filial pride and detached admiration coloring his expression. She was a master of this stage, her performance as flawless as the diamonds at her throat. He noted the appreciative nods from board members, the captivated smiles of investors. It was the Vance legacy, polished and presented for public consumption. A perfect, unblemished story. But from the shadowed alcove near the grand entrance, a different story was about to be told. Sarah Jenkins felt the vibrations of the applause through the marble floor, each clap a small tremor against her heart. The righteous fire that had ignited within her had not cooled. It had forged itself into a cold, hard resolve. Her mother's name, Elizabeth Jenkins, echoed in her mind, a silent mantra of courage. Her sister Emily's face, so full of trust and hope, was the fuel. She took a deep, steadying breath, her fingers tightening around the cool, familiar handle of her cane. Then she moved. The first tap of her cane on the marble was a quiet disruption. easily lost in the lingering echo of applause. The second was more distinct. By the third, a few heads had turned. Mrs. Vance had just launched into an anecdote about her late husband, Elijah Vance, a man she was painting as a visionary titan of industry. A man whose vision was so clear he saw the future before anyone else. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was insistent now, a steady, rhythmic beat cutting through the opulent stillness. It was the sound of purpose. It was the sound of the invisible world making itself known. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as Sarah emerged from the shadows, her simple black uniform a stark slash against the glittering tapestry of the gala. She was not hurrying, her pace deliberate, each step measured, guided by the familiar feel of the floor through her cane. William Vance's brow furrowed. His first reaction was a flash of pure annoyance. Security should have handled this. What was a server doing, creating a scene during his mother's keynote address? He saw the security chief, a burly man named Marcus, begin to move from the side of the room, his expression a mixture of apology and alarm. Mrs. Vance faltered mid-sentence, her practiced smile tightening at the edges. Her eyes, cold as chips of ice, locked onto the approaching figure. "And that vision is something we carry forward," she stammered, her composure beginning to fray under the unprecedented interruption. A collective gasp, soft but audible, swept through the room as Sarah reached the foot of the low stage. She stopped, positioning herself directly in front of the podium, a small, still figure in the face of immense power. Marcus and another guard were closing in, but before they could reach her, Sarah spoke. Her voice, though not loud, was perfectly clear, carrying a resonant authority that sliced through the charged silence. "Mrs. Vance?" The two words hung in the air, a direct challenge. Eleanor Vance's face contorted, indignation warring with disbelief. She leaned into the microphone, her voice a venomous hiss. "Who is this girl? Someone remove her at once." But Sarah did not flinch. She ignored the advancing guards, her head held high, her unseen gaze fixed in the direction of the matriarch's voice. "You speak of legacy and integrity," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "But what of the legacy built on shadows and the integrity stolen from those who truly built it?" A wave of shocked whispers washed over the audience. William leaned forward in his seat, his irritation completely evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp-edged curiosity. There was something in this young woman's tone, not madness, not desperation, but an unshakable certainty that was utterly unnerving. Mrs. Vance's face, which had been flushed with anger, began to drain of all color. The word shadows seemed to strike her with physical force. She gripped the sides of the podium, her knuckles white. Sarah took one more step forward, a symbolic claiming of the space. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she declared, her voice ringing with the weight of generations of silence. "My mother was Elizabeth Jenkins, and she was the co-inventor of the foundational patent upon which Vance Enterprises was truly built, patented on June 7th, 1986. The precision of the date landed like a judgment. It was not a vague accusation. It was a fact. In the silent corridor, listening to Mr. Thompson, it had been a key. Here, in the open, it was a weapon. The room, which had been buzzing with confused murmurs, went completely, utterly silent. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of a 50-year-old lie being torn open. As the name Elizabeth Jenkins and the specific date echoed in the cavernous hall, Sarah's hand went to her throat. With a slow, deliberate movement, she gently lifted the sterling silver necklace from beneath the collar of her uniform. The stage lights caught the intricate raised dots of the Braille inscription, making them glint like tiny scattered diamonds. "This necklace," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly now, not with fear, but with the profound emotion of the moment, "holds her words, her truth, and the precise legal details of her partnership agreement, details that were quietly, meticulously, and illegally buried by your late husband, Mr. Elijah Vance." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before delivering the final devastating blow. "The same agreement Mr. Thompson was discussing with you just moments ago in the hallway, fearing its discovery. It was done. The truth was out, raw and undeniable. Laid bare before the very people the Vances had spent a lifetime cultivating. Eleanor Vance looked as if she had seen a ghost. Her carefully constructed mask of poise and power did not just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. A faint, strangled sound escaped her lips. Her eyes, wide with a horror that was primal and absolute, darted from Sarah to Mr. Thompson, who stood frozen near the back, his face ashen. She was exposed. The humiliation she had so casually inflicted upon Sarah earlier that evening was nothing compared to this. This was not a social slight. This was the complete annihilation of a legacy. Every eye in the room, every privileged gaze that had once dismissed Sarah as part of the furniture, was now fixed upon her with a mixture of awe, shock, and dawning comprehension. She was no longer Sarah Jenkins, the blind server. She was Sarah Jenkins, the heir to a stolen empire, the voice of a silenced genius. The power dynamic of the room had not just shifted, it had been inverted with shocking, devastating force. From the front row, William Vance stared, his mind reeling. The foundations of his entire life, the story of his family's greatness, had been demolished in less than 2 minutes. He looked at Sarah, truly looked at her for the first time. He didn't see a uniform or a cane. He saw the fierce, unyielding dignity he had glimpsed earlier, now magnified 1,000 times. He saw a courage so profound it took his breath away. He saw his grandfather's sin and his mother's complicity reflected in her quiet strength. And in that moment, a wave of shame so deep it was nauseating washed over him. The shame of his ignorance, the shame of his privilege, the shame of a name now stained by an unforgivable betrayal. The gala, meant to be the crowning celebration of the Vance dynasty, had become its public trial. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet, it was deafening, pregnant with the fallout of revelation. It was the sound of a world breaking. Slowly, deliberately, as if moving through water, William Vance rose to his feet. His gaze never left Sarah's determined face. He ignored the shocked look from the board member beside him, ignored the frantic, pleading stare from his own mother on the stage. There was only one person in the room who mattered now. He took a step, and then another. His mind, usually a whirlwind of market projections and corporate strategy, had gone completely still, focused on a single monumental task that was just beginning to form. Atonement. He began to move toward the stage, toward the woman who had just dismantled his world in order to reclaim her own. The silence that followed Sarah's declaration was not empty. It was a physical presence, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered the music, the laughter, and the very air in the grand ballroom. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the frantic, digital whir of 100 phone cameras capturing Eleanor Vance's face as it crumbled. The carefully constructed mask of aristocratic indifference, perfected over 70 years, shattered into a million pieces, revealing the raw, terrified woman beneath. Then the whispers began, a low hiss that grew into a roar of scandalized murmurs. "Did you hear that? Jenkins. Elizabeth Jenkins. My God. The necklace. It's in Braille." Security personnel who had been frozen in indecision finally surged forward, their purpose muddled. Were they to remove the accuser or protect the matriarch? William Vance made the decision for them. He took 3 long strides, not toward his mother, but toward Sarah, placing himself between her and the approaching guards. He raised a hand, a sharp, commanding gesture that stopped them cold. His eyes, which had always held a detached corporate coolness, were now fixed on Sarah with an expression she couldn't decipher, a maelstrom of shock, horror, and a dawning, terrible respect. He didn't speak to her, not yet. He simply stood as a shield, his presence a silent public acknowledgement that something fundamental had broken. The gala was over. The Vance legacy, as the world knew it, was dead. Later that night, the Vance mansion on Fifth Avenue felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The crystal chandeliers seemed to weep light onto the cold marble floors. William found his mother in the study, a glass of amber liquid trembling in her hand. She hadn't changed out of her gown, but it now hung on her like a shroud. "You should have let them throw her out," Eleanor hissed, her voice thin and brittle. "And say what? that Vance Enterprises is built on lies, that our family's unblemished integrity is a fairy tale. William's voice was dangerously calm. He walked over to the towering portrait of his father, Elijah Vance, that hung above the fireplace. The man's painted eyes seemed to sneer with posthumous arrogance. "Did you know, Mother? Did you know what he did to Elizabeth Jenkins?" Eleanor took a sharp, shaky sip of her drink. "Your father was a brilliant businessman. He made difficult choices for the good of this family. For you." "That's not an answer," William said, turning to face her. The calmness was gone, replaced by a raw anguish. He didn't just make a difficult choice. He erased a woman. He stole her life's work, condemned her to poverty, and left her daughter, her two daughters, to struggle for every scrap while we lived in this museum built on theft. He gestured around the opulent room, his arms sweeping across priceless art and antique furniture. "All of this is a monument to a crime." A single tear finally traced a path through Eleanor's perfect makeup. "I knew he sidelined a partner," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know her name. I didn't know about the children. Elijah handled those things. He said it was for the best, that she was compensated fairly. I chose to believe him." "You chose not to see," William corrected, the judgment in his voice as sharp as a blade. "Just like you chose not to see Sarah Jenkins tonight. You saw a uniform, a cane, an inconvenience. You didn't see a person. You didn't see the inheritor of the very genius that started all of this." He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the brass handle. "That ends now. I am going to fix this. Not for the company, Mother. For them." 2 days later, William found Sarah not through a team of lawyers, but by waiting quietly in the small, unassuming coffee shop near her apartment building, a place he'd learned she visited every morning before her shift. When she entered, her cane tapping a familiar rhythm, he stood. She stopped, her head tilting as she recognized the sound of his expensive shoes on the linoleum. Her posture stiffened immediately. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice devoid of the fire from the gala, replaced by a weary, protective coldness. "If you're here to offer me a settlement to stay quiet, you can save your breath." "I'm not," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. May I buy you a coffee, Ms. Jenkins, please? I won't speak of legal matters, I just want to talk." Hesitantly, she agreed. They sat at a small table in the corner, the steam from their cups rising between them. For a long time, he just looked at her, truly looked, seeing the exhaustion under her eyes, the fierce intelligence in her bearing, the strength that held her together. "What you did," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed. You spoke truth to a room built on polite lies. You honored your mother." He paused, struggling for the right words. "My family owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. But I am going to spend the rest of my life trying." Sarah listened, her expression unreadable, her hand resting near the silver necklace that now seemed to hum with a life of its own. She was waiting for the catch, the corporate spin. It never came. Instead, William spoke of his own shame, of the willful blindness he'd inherited. He didn't make excuses, he took responsibility. "This isn't about damage control," he said, meeting her unseen gaze as if he could will her to feel his sincerity. "This is about restoration. I want to restore your mother's name to its rightful place. I want the world to know who Elizabeth Jenkins was." He slid a folder across the table. "These are initial proposals. A public foundation in her name, funding STEM education for visually impaired students. The renaming of our primary research and development wing to the Elizabeth Jenkins Center for Innovation. And, of course, the full restitution of her share of the company, with interest calculated over 37 years. To you and your sister, Emily. This isn't hush money, Sarah. This is justice, long overdue." For the first time since this ordeal began, Sarah's composure cracked. The financial figures were staggering, life-altering, but it was the other words that broke through her defenses. The Elizabeth Jenkins Center for Innovation. Her mother's name, spoken with reverence, attached to a legacy of creation instead of a history of erasure. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and hot. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. The scandal dominated the headlines, But the narrative, carefully guided by William and a new ethical PR team, shifted from one of corporate malfeasance to one of profound public atonement. At a press conference that was watched by millions, Sarah stood at a podium, not as a victim, but as the proud daughter of a visionary. William stood beside her, not as a CEO, but as a humble witness to her truth. The most significant change, however, happened far from the cameras, in the quiet, sterile halls of a cutting-edge neurological institute. Sarah sat beside her sister Emily as a doctor explained a new gene therapy treatment, a procedure that had once been an impossible dream. "With these resources," the doctor said, smiling gently, "the prognosis is exceptionally hopeful." Emily, who had only ever known a world of shadows, squeezed Sarah's hand, her own small face illuminated by a possibility she had never dared to imagine. In that moment, the entire fight, the humiliation, the fear, it all became worth it. This was the true inheritance. Not just wealth, but a future. Sarah Jenkins never returned to serving champagne at galas. She accepted a position on the board of the new Elizabeth Jenkins Foundation, her unique perspective and unwavering integrity becoming the moral compass for its mission. She worked alongside William, their relationship evolving into a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared purpose. The Vance name, once a symbol of ruthless power, was slowly being redefined by its commitment to making amends, a transformation forged in the crucible of one woman's courage. One crisp autumn evening, Sarah stood on the terrace of the newly dedicated Innovation Center, the city lights of New York sprawling before her like a carpet of scattered diamonds. She touched the cool silver of her necklace, the Braille beneath her fingertips no longer a secret burden, but a public testament. It was a story of a mother's love, a daughter's fight, and the profound truth that no one is truly invisible. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to step into the light, forcing the rest of the world to finally see.